On Tuesday, the 1st of March, 2005 year, at 10:30 in the morning, financier Sandy Koifman had an appointment with his former partner Edward Stern. Koifman was a mathematician by profession, but 6 years ago, he decided to change his field of activity and became a trader. He started trading securities on the stock exchange. Both men have worked side by side for 6 years. Until last spring, Koifman founded his own company. He and Stern broke up with friends. But the men did not lose sight of each other. We chatted about markets every day and treated each other to pizza on Sundays. They even continued to work in the same building. During the reorganization, Koifman remained working on the last 8th floor, and Stern moved to the 7th floor of the green glass business center he had previously purchased, located at Orvillers, Geneva, Switzerland. The business center was located opposite the Natural History Museum of Geneva and next to a residential building, which was also entirely owned by Auchtern. Stern was currently living in the penthouse of this house. Edward's ultra-luxurious residential complex was located in one of the most prestigious areas of Geneva. Geneva is a city in which ordinary citizens can report a speeding car driver or a hooligan throwing an apple core on the sidewalk to the police. And the police, in turn, will diligently search for the violator and punish him to the fullest extent of the law. Not far from the city, there are snow-capped Alps and Lake Geneva dotted with luxury yachts. Or Lake Lyman, as it is called in French, which is spoken in this part of Switzerland. Geneva is one of the most pristine and unspoiled major cities in Europe. A city where you can manage the huge fortunes of many banks located here. The confidentiality and identity of the account holders are jealously guarded. Representatives of Swiss banks, and indeed the whole of Switzerland, are proud of the circumspect delicacy that they offer to their clients from all over the world. Geneva is a surprisingly safe city compared to the major megacities of the rest of the world. A city where millionaires can freely walk the streets or drive around in their Rolls-Royces or Bentleys, and do not worry about the safety of your life and your property. But even in this seemingly safe environment, Edward Stern, the hero of our story today, did not feel safe. He equipped his luxury apartment with an additional security alarm and video cameras, both around and inside the building belonging to him at Adrien Lachina, 17. Stern lived on the 5th floor, surrounded from above and below by other wealthy tenants. The Geneva police station was located on the ground floor. Stern also obtained a concealed carry permit for firearms and owned several pistols. It is difficult to get a permit for firearms in Europe, but Stern, being the scion of an influential family of French bankers, connected by blood and descent with the business and political leaders of France, had connections in high circles. Edward had a reason to get this permission. Recently, he has been threatened with death several times by unknown people. As for his friend Sandy Koifman, this was the first interview in his life. He stopped the elevator, and together with the reporter they descended from the 8th floor, which Koifman occupies, to the 7th, which Stern occupied. The room on this floor is small and dim. Several glass-walled offices are grouped around a platform, where a couple of assistants study multicolored columns of numbers on computer screens. Koifman points to the left in the direction of Stern's corner office. The door is still sealed with 2 strips of red police tape. Then they go down to the 1st floor and go outside. On the street, they walk a block and enter Stern's favorite restaurant, which specializes in sushi preparation. The restaurant is called Hashimoto. Koifman begins his story. On Monday, February 28th, my wife and I were sitting in this corner, and Edward was sitting there. He points to another corner table. 1. He was reading a newspaper. He kissed my wife 3 times on the cheek in the traditional Swiss way. Completely banal, completely normal. It was Monday afternoon. As it turns out later, Stern will visit this restaurant again that evening. He will be alone again. Koifman spoke to him on the phone once or twice that Monday. The former partners discussed the rates on Eurobonds and other working issues. After work on weekdays, friends usually did not communicate. They could only meet on the weekend to eat pizza. According to colleagues and relatives of Edward Stern, he lived a quiet life outside the office. His everyday clothes at home and at work were blue jeans and t-shirts. He preferred to have dinner at home alone, with an apple and yogurt. He was an avid reader. I read it always and everywhere. Although Sandy Koifman boasted that he had captivated a friend with 2 American TV series, The West Wing and 24 Hours. The next morning, Edward didn't show up for his 10:30 appointment with Sandy. And before that, at 9 o'clock in the morning, he also missed a meeting with a restaurant owner who wanted to invest. 10 minutes later, the janitor called Koifman and informed him that Stern had not come to work in the morning. This behavior was very atypical for Edward. He was late almost constantly, but he always called and warned about it. However, Koifman did not worry. He assumed that Stern was in his apartment. Just a week ago, he bought a brand new green Bentley Mulsanne for $300,000. And Koifman saw this car in the parking lot that morning when he parked his car next to it. So Edward was definitely at home. Then at 11 o'clock in the morning, Stern missed a meeting with his friend William Browder, who ran the Hermitage Capital Management Fund. Stern's secretary called Koifman and asked if they were together now. Koifman replied that they were not together and added that he also had not seen him today. Sandy Koifman, who began to worry a little, called Stern's apartment. There was no response. Then he called his cell phone. No one picked up the phone either. He called twice more, and then went to Hashimoto. He visited him at 12:30. After talking to Stern's secretary at 13:45, he was surprised to learn that the man never showed up for work. Worried, Koifman returned to the office and asked one of Stern's assistants for the key to his apartment. The key was searched for a long time, but they could not find it. While the assistant called the concierge of Stern's house, whose wife, Maria Perez, usually cleaned Edward's apartment. Koifman called the nearest hospital. It took half an hour to make sure that there was no one by the name of Stern or men matching his description. At 14:30, Koifman and 2 of his assistants met the concierge and his wife in the corridor outside Stern's apartment. I thought maybe he slipped and fell in the bathroom, recalls Koifman. I had a friend who died of a heart attack at the age of 45. The men started calling all the hospitals in the city. Having not received any useful information, Sandy ordered to unlock the door leading to the home of his former business partner. The first thing Pyers did after she used the key and entered the apartment was to check whether the burglar alarm was activated. It turned out that it was disabled. Koifman went inside with his assistants. The concierge and his wife went out and waited in the corridor. The first thing Koifman noticed was a small table behind the door. On it was Stern's cell phone, his wallet and keys. Edward called Sandy. There was no response. Koifman looked to the right into the kitchen. There was no one there. Stern's spacious living room was paneled in light cape wood. The walls were decorated with works of modern art. 2 of Edward's windbreakers were lying on the sofa. Sandy called his friend's name again, but there was no answer again. Then Sandy went to the bedroom door. It was ajar. There was a pair of sneakers next to the door. Perez also noticed the shoes, and it seemed strange to her such sloppiness. She knew that her employer was almost paranoid about order and cleanliness. Edward called Sandy for the 3rd time. There was no sound from the bedroom. He came close to the door, pushed it with his finger, and the door opened. The bedroom was made without frills. A simple room, a large bed, king-sized, as the Americans would say, and nothing more. It was a room for total relaxation. Not a single thing was visible. Everything was in the built-in cabinets. There was something strange lying on the floor just outside the door, and a huge puddle was spreading under this object. At first, Koifman thought it was a work of modern art. The French call this surreal art. It took me a moment to realize that I was looking at a corpse in Edward's apartment. He was covered from head to toe with some kind of flesh. It was a colored suit. I found out later that it was latex. There were no holes on the front part. I do not know how it was possible to breathe in it at all. He looked more like a mannequin not yet dressed. The corpse was lying on its side. It was impossible to see the face of the man dressed in this strange costume. Nothing could be seen. A thin white rope was tied around the body. There was an overturned chair nearby. There were several more ropes on the chair. It looked creepy, he says. Have you watched the movie Seven? That's what it was like. Sandy then took out his phone and called the police, informing them that he had apparently found a corpse. The police arrived at the specified address a few minutes later. The next call at 1417 Koifman made to France, to the country house of lawyer Kristen Van Riel. The butler told him that Van Riel was unwell. It's really very urgent, Koifman said. Get him on the phone right now. A moment later, an exasperated Van Riel answered the phone. What could be so urgent at this time of day? Kristen, get your ass to Geneva right now. Or I just found Edward's body in his bedroom, which means you need to sort out all the administrative documents. Or I've found someone else's body, and in this case you're looking at a completely different set of problems that need to be dealt with. Koifman noted that the body was the same size as Stern's. He began to guess that, most likely, this is Edward. As soon as Koifman hung up, Van Riel called him back and asked if he was sure it was Edward. To which Sandy replied that, although he knew nothing about Stern's sex life, this latex suit looks like some kind of perversion, and explained that it makes it impossible to identify the body without disturbing the scene. After describing the details, Kristen, without a doubt, replied, "This is Edward." It was then that Sandy Koifman realized that Kristen and Henriel knew about his client's latex suits, and about the problems in Edward's life. He knew everything? Who was this famous, and at the same time mysterious financier? Edward Stern was born on the 18th of October, 1954 year in Paris, in one of the richest families in France. Owners of the private investment house Stern Bank. His father, Antoine Jean Stern, was a descendant of a famous Jewish family of bankers from Frankfurt. His mother, Christiane Laroche, was the ex-wife of French journalist and politician Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber. Edward, as they say, was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. The boy was taught from birth to be a great man. After all, he was the sole heir of a man whose family had been taking care of the needs of the French aristocracy since 1823. Young Edward grew up in a townhouse located in the posh 7th arrondissement of the French capital. The boy's childhood proceeded as the childhood of the most ordinary child from a rich family, with her two half-sisters from her mother's first marriage, and his own younger sister. He spent his summer holidays at the Dinar Resort in Britain, and winter holidays skiing in the luxury resort of Megève, which is often visited by Hollywood stars. He became an experienced skier, rider, tennis golfer, hunter, and a black belt in karate. Later, he was sent to study at a school in England so that he could improve his English. Returning to Paris, he entered the elite Essex Business Academy, the higher school of economic and commercial sciences. Then he lived modestly in a small apartment in Chinatown, in the 13th arrondissement of Paris. There is a story whose authenticity has not been confirmed, that during his studies, Wessex Stern argued with a classmate that he would be able to drive his golf key in the city at a speed of more than 180 kilometers per hour. A group of friends armed with stopwatches gathered at 3 in the morning to watch it. When Stern drove by in a car, they saw that it was really moving at a speed of more than 190 kilometers per hour. Unfortunately, this was also seen by the police patrol, which detained Stern. For this trick, he was deprived of his driver's license. And some time later, Stern posted an ad on the business school bulletin board asking, "Does anyone want to drive his sports car twice a day?" Several classmates responded, and that's how Stern got his first personal driver. Friends who knew Edward as a teenager describe him as stubborn, impulsive, impatient, and full of self-confidence, a strong young man who looks boldly into the future. His closest friend was David Braunschwick. They had a common math tutor, and they spent their free time riding motorcycles, chasing girls, and playing golf. 20 years later, Brunswick renewed his friendship with Edward, when both ended up at Laser, a consulting firm engaged in investment banking, asset management, and other financial services. Laser is also the world's largest independent investment bank. What struck me was that, although he has achieved tremendous success during this time, he has not changed. It preserves the continuity between a teenager and an experienced businessman. "I found it very interesting," says Braunschwick. "The way he stood out both in his youth and in adulthood, I would describe as a dashing character. Everything he did quickly and brilliantly. He always wanted to challenge the existing order of things. There were no taboos for him." As a result of strictness and discipline in education, many European children develop shy or withdrawn behavior. Edward was always outspoken and disrespectful. This is because from an early age he had a huge sense of self-worth. He was not threatened by any existing order. He wrote his own rules. In 1976 year, when Stern was 22 years old, his grandmother and uncle suggested that he replace his own father as president of the tottering bank. Stern. "The relationship with my father, of course, was destroyed." French newspapers called Edward a terrible child and condemned him for the expulsion of his own father. For newspaper headlines, he was just a monster, recalls decorator Robert Couturier, a friend of the Stern family. Edward, who despised publicity, never allowed outsiders into his personal life. Stern's grandmother, who fled the Nazis during the war and worked as a saleswoman at Bergdorf Goodman on Fifth Avenue. "I was worried that my grandson does not have trusted people of his age among the graying employees of the bank." And she invited a dapper young lawyer named Kristen Van Riel, who will remain a lawyer and a resonator of Edward's ideas for the next 25 years. Van Riel would later become steward of Stern's estate. "Everyone said that Edward stole his father's jar," Van Riel said in an interview. "But he couldn't do it because he didn't have a single share." All this was done by his grandmother and two brothers' fathers. They did it all. They kicked him out. His father was about to leave when Edward was brought to save the bank, which he did. In 1983, the 29-year-old Stern married Beatrice David Weil, the daughter of Michelle David Weil, the head of the Laser Bank in New York. In the 1980s, Stern reorganized the family bank, expanding its activities in the financial markets, as well as in the field of mergers and acquisitions. Thus, Edward Stern not only saved the Stern Bank from bankruptcy, but also returned it to profitability, eventually receiving an unthinkable $335 million for a deal to sell it to Lebanese investors in 1985 year. Thanks to the clause attached to the contract, Edward retained the copyright to his surname. Immediately after the sale, he founded a new bank with a similar name and business profile, and attracted many of his former clients there. In 1988, he sold this bank for almost 2 billion francs to the Swiss banking corporation SBs. As a result of these transactions, Stern broke into the ranks of the richest people in France, taking the 38th place in the Forbes list. Speculation spread overnight about what he would do next. His marriage to Beatrice in 1984 allowed Stern to enter the influential family of David Weil, and made him a candidate for the management of a large structure. By the age of 32, he was already in the status of CEO. Almost everyone he talked to talked about how Stern dominated any room he entered. He had a huge charm, says Braunschweig. He was practically irresistible. When he entered the room and started talking, it attracted people's attention. No, not because of the seriousness of his intentions, but simply, there are people who have an irresistible appearance. Charisma. He had it all from his earliest years. After the sale of the banks, Stern spent 5 years stretching his legs, investing in various businesses with his second cousin and close friend Jace Goldsmith. Finally, in 1992, Edward accepted his father-in-law's invitation to join the laser team, where he was included in the executive committee. It was assumed that he was being trained to replace David Weil, since the latter had only daughters, and Stern was considered the sole heir of the banking magnate. However, from the very beginning, this scheme failed. Stern had the mindset of a principal-rich investor, while Lazar's reputation was built on service. That is, serving rich clients. Worse, his move coincided with a rare period of unrest at the Test Bank, which Edward, with his inherent humorous style of doing business, only aggravated. Stern not only did not calm the anxiety of some partners, but on the contrary, excited them. It is said that very few people in this firm liked him. He was absolutely ruthless. Symbolism is very important in laser. The way you act, the way you worship Michelle, its founder. Edward didn't care about any of this. He didn't care who he could piss off. He was rich and used to doing things his own way. He had plenty of money to send anyone. And that's exactly how he acted. The number of complaints against Stern grew, and in the middle of 1997, he got into a heated argument with one of Lazard's partners in Paris about which of them should take a seat on the board of directors of a leading French aluminum company. For David Weil, this was the last straw. Stern was asked to leave the company. His severance pay was very generous. The Al-Azhar subsidiary agreed to invest $300 million in a fund that Stern started managing from Geneva, a tax haven that was also one of his favorite cities. Stern, in turn, agreed to invest the money. A remarkable fact from the biography of Edward. Once during a trip to Moscow, where he invested in the Hermitage Fund. When he was returning to his plane, an immigration officer noticed that Stern could not leave the country because there were too many Russian rubles in his wallet. "I don't think this is a problem," Stern was indignant. "Do you have a lighter?" When the guard gave him a lighter, Stern dramatically burned a bundle of banknotes worth several $1,000s. The staff immediately dropped all questions, and Edward was released from Russia. He spent most of his time traveling the world, exploring investment opportunities in Moscow, Tokyo, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and other places. He was a fan of modern art, opera, and history. He often quoted Churchill and Napoleon. Stern spent a whole month hunting big game every year, mostly in Africa. He had an extensive collection of weapons. The heads of dead animals with glittering glass eyes were hung on the walls of his carriage house on the territory of a vast estate, a huge 17th-century castle located on several hundred acres near Paris. Being an avid hunter, Stern also had a fairly large arsenal of rifles, pistols, and rifles in his penthouse. An anonymous police source said that there were over 50 firearms in the penthouse, many of which were large caliber. The source also said that only half of his collection was registered. Edward had two sides to celebrate Sandy Koifman. In his personal life, at lunch and dinner, he was charming, witty, in a word, an ideal French intellectual. He could remember almost any highlight that Churchill had ever uttered. He could continue endless discussions about contemporary art, music, and about anything. But there was another side to his character. It was this country that frightened subordinates and made close friends shudder. He had the lowest tolerance for stupidity. But it didn't bother him at all. This quality was especially strong at work. He fired people for the slightest mistake, and often he had screaming fits. During outbursts of rage, he often called subordinates damn idiots, although he often apologized afterwards. There was a very high turnover of staff in his office. One day, Stern hired a new stock analyst and a new trader. One day, when the analyst was on vacation, Edward asked the trader to work analytically for a while. The trader did not cope with the analytical work, was called a damn idiot, and was immediately fired. A month later, he fired an analyst who performed poorly as a trader. To the objection of colleagues that these tasks did not correspond to their job descriptions, Stern replied, "You are all my slaves. Do it." Stern also took food in a very unusual way. As mentioned earlier, his favorite dish was sushi. But the most distinctive and unusual characteristic of Edward was the amount of sushi he ate. He could eat 50 or 70 pieces in one sitting. His usual restaurant bill was $300 or $400. Often, when Edward ordered such huge portions, the waiter asked again if he was mistaken or if he was expecting someone else. Because there was enough sushi to feed 5 people to their full. Edward's metabolism was about 3 times higher than that of the average person. At the same time, he never gained excess weight. Stern's insatiable appetite, combined with his impatience, played a cruel joke on him in the financial world. Even when he was presented with an investment opportunity of $50 million or more, he could make a decision in a matter of minutes. His investment style was a mixture of scrupulousness and impulsiveness. He was very confident in his abilities and therefore made a decision very quickly. Sometimes too fast. Stern was so impulsive that Sandy Koifman introduced the 24-hour rule. In other words, the money could not be invested for at least 24 hours after such an opportunity was presented. Haste became a problem with his third and largest investment of $89 million, which he invested in a rodeo firm. It was a disaster. Soon after, his company's stock began to fall. In short, Stern began to openly swear with the leadership of Rody. When that didn't work, he started fighting for a seat on the company's board of directors. In 2003, he lost. Later that year, he sued. The trial turned out to be very complicated. In the middle of the 2004 year, when the court disputes became tougher, Stern had a strange conversation with a judge in France, in which the judge suggested that Edward get a permit to carry weapons. He later obtained a similar permit for Switzerland. But Edward did not make any efforts to increase his personal security, and did not hire a bodyguard. However, he was openly worried, and it bothered his partners. That is why on Tuesday, the 1st of March, 2005 year, when Koifman discovered Stern's body, a number of his associates immediately recalled the trial in the road case. Moreover, the economic and political leadership of France has been closely intertwined for decades, within the framework of an economic policy called dirigism. For example, the head of the audit committee, Rody Thierry Breton, became the Minister of Finance of France in 2005 year, shortly after leaving Rhodium. The news of the death of 50-year-old Edward Stern, like a monsoon, swept the highest social and financial circles of New York and Paris. Everyone knew Edward Stern, or at least had heard of him. In Paris, his death was equivalent to the death of Rockefeller. Until 1998, he was married to Beatrice David Weil, daughter of the chairman of the Laser Michel David Weil. Edward and Beatrice, who at the time of his death worked at Sotheby's in Manhattan, had 3 children. The children lived with their mother. However, after the divorce, the former spouses remained close friends, sometimes talking on the phone several times a day. Beatrice even knew the names of her ex-husband's new friends. However, on that day, the 1st of March, 2005, Edward did not call her. The woman began to get nervous. On that day, the unusually calm city of Geneva was unusually busy and crowded. The second day of the Geneva Motor Show, one of the world's largest exhibitions of the automotive industry, was coming to an end. Thousands of journalists, car industry executives and experts created traffic jams, driving to their hotels. Anyone who stood in traffic that day with the radio on quickly learned that a major financier was found dead today under mysterious circumstances. The news spread quickly. Within hours of Stern's death, bizarre theories were circulating in Geneva, Paris, and New York, many of which related to investments he was rumored to have made in Russia and interference in the Russian mafia. Others were related to a brutal lawsuit that he conducted with a French company in which he invested a lot of money. Rumors about the condition in which his body was found, with a flair of sadomasochism or other fetishism, turned out to be too obscene, even for the usually restrained and circumspect authorities of Geneva. Soon they leaked into the media and spread all over the world. Then, 48 hours after the discovery of the body, the Swiss newspaper Tribune de Genève literally detonated a bomb in the news world. Edward Stern was actually killed. He was shot 4 times. But an even more startling discovery was that he was found wearing a flesh-colored latex bodysuit. The murder mystery, which at first seemed filled with political and corporate intrigues, suddenly took a sharp turn towards sexual perversion. Many people, especially bankers, still couldn't get out of their heads the news about the death of billionaire banker Edmond Safry, who died in a fire at his home in Monaco in December 1999. His death also looked rather strange. On the night before the fire, for some reason, all his guards were dismissed to their homes, which had never been done before. And the fire, as it turns out later, was set by Safra's personal nurse, named Ted Marr. In the past, an officer of the US Special Forces Green Berets. Immediately after his arrest, Marr said that 2 intruders had entered the mansion, and that he had fought them off, having received stab wounds. He informed another nurse about the attackers and gave her his mobile phone so she could call for help. He ordered her to take Edmond Safra to a safe place, and he went to the nearest medical center, where he lit toilet paper in a trash basket to activate a smoke alarm with the intention of attracting attention. The paper caught fire, and the fire spread to the walls of the building. Marr, bleeding and feeling weak, went down to the lobby of the building for help. But although the police and firefighters reached the building instantly, they could not save the banker and the nurse from the fire. A few days later, Monaco's chief prosecutor announced that Marr had confessed to setting the fire to attract the attention of his employer, because he was jealous of Safra's 7 other nurses. In addition, it turned out that he inflicted the stab wounds on himself. Ted Marr was subsequently sentenced to 10 years in prison. And then there's the mysterious death of another banker from the Forbes list, Edward Stern. The investigation of Stern's murder was entrusted to investigator Michel Alexander Graeber. The latter will have to decide based on the evidence discovered by the Geneva Judicial Police. Will the Canton of Geneva be able to successfully bring to justice the murderer or the killers of Stern? Switzerland, or rather the Swiss Confederation, consists of 26 sovereign states cantons. Each canton has its own ruling government, treasury, judicial system, police and laws, schools and universities, where education is conducted in the official language of the canton, German, French, Italian or Romansh. Each canton also has its own capital. Neva is also the capital of the canton of Geneva. Bern is the general or federal capital and seat of the federal government. which is responsible for the armed forces and border guards of the Confederation. The cantonal police authorities are subordinate not to the federal authorities, but to the cantonal governing councils. Graeber told reporters only that Edward Stern's body was found in his penthouse. The banking world has also closed ranks. Swiss bankers must sign a client confidentiality statement twice a year under oath. They should also commit themselves to reporting to their superiors about any unusual transactions on customer accounts. For example, if a large amount of money is deposited by direct transfer to the client's account by someone, say, in Australia or Argentina, and after a few days, this amount is transferred to another account, say, in Paris or Panama, a private consultant or client's advisor is required to call the client for an explanation. If the client's explanation seems suspicious, the bank immediately begins an investigation. Of course, all this is done carefully and as kindly as possible. But these days, Swiss banks remain extremely vigilant against money laundering. This important clarification will play a role in the investigation. The autopsy showed that 4 9mm bullets were fired at Stern. 2 of them are stuck in the head and 2 in the chest. One of the ones in his head was right between his eyes. Forensic examination showed that this bullet was fired first. Edward died instantly. But 3 more bullets were fired at him. 1 bullet, even 2 bullets to the head, could certainly indicate that the shooter was a professional killer. But the fact that 4 shots were fired from the pistol indicated the opposite. The killer wasn't a professional. It turns out that the killer was standing next to an already dead person, but continued to shoot in anger, hatred, or revenge, exclaiming, "Get it, bastard." And as we already know, Edward Stern had plenty of enemies. Stern repeatedly mentioned to several colleagues that he was concerned about the rodeo case. As you remember, he applied for a permit to carry a weapon. French gun laws make it extremely difficult to obtain a permit. And if the application is granted, the permit usually prohibits the owner from taking the weapon outside of his home. Stern, on the other hand, had no problems getting a permit to wear without any restrictions. The then Minister of the Interior of France was a man named Nicolas Sarkozy, who later became President of France. Stern was a friend of Sarkozy and his then-wife Cecilia. The police found letters written in the handwriting of Nicolas and Cecilia among Stern's personal papers in his penthouse. A gun permit issued to Stern by the French allowed him to carry firearms anytime and anywhere in France. Swiss gun laws are much less strict than French laws. This means that Stern also had no problems getting a gun permit in Switzerland. The percentage of gun ownership among the population in Switzerland is the highest in Europe, with an estimated 3 million firearms owners per population of 7 million people. Not only do Swiss soldiers and police officers keep their weapons at home, all able-bodied Swiss men between the ages of 20 and 34 are army reservists and also keep their weapons at home. In addition, as you remember, he had an extensive collection of hunting weapons. So, if Stern was armed to the teeth, then why didn't he defend himself? And also, who and why forced him to wear a latex suit? Maybe he was addicted to sadomasochism, and the sexual game in which weapons were used did not go according to plan at all. For several days after the news of Edward's murder, the French and Swiss press raged with rumors and speculation about a possible connection of his death with rodeo, or with the Russian mafia. But following Swiss discretion, Geneva researchers soon identified the main suspect in the murder of Edward, about whom the press remained in the dark until the police made an arrest. In Geneva, it is very easy to find women willing to sell their bodies, and there is a great demand for them. Switzerland's policy of neutrality makes the country an ideal choice for the headquarters of international organizations such as the UN, UNICEF, OCHR, UNHCR, and the Red Cross. and the proximity of Geneva to such capitals as Beaune, London, Paris, and Rome makes the city an ideal conference center. At least 200 international organizations have their European headquarters in Geneva, and about 8,000 international conferences are held there every year. Therefore, there are a lot of men who have left their wives or girlfriends at home. As a result, the sex industry is thriving in the city. Prostitution is legal in Switzerland, and each canton has its own laws. They determine where and how a prostitute can do her job. However, prostitution is prohibited in every canton, in areas near churches, schools, and hospitals. This list also includes residential areas. Prostitutes must register with the police and undergo regular medical examinations. Pimping is not allowed, and confusion is not allowed to flaunt their wares. The Swiss AIDS Federation estimates that there are 14,000 prostitutes in the country, of which 92% are women. The number of their clients, all of whom are men, is estimated at 550,000 people a year. The official age of consent in the country is 16 years. The canton of Geneva legalized prostitution before the rest in October of 1992. And today, according to estimates of social workers, only in the city of Geneva, with a population of 202,000 people, there are 1,500 prostitutes. Most of the prostitutes of this city came from Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, and Romania. Also, a considerable part are French women. In 2000, Switzerland signed the Schengen Agreement of the European Union, which opened the country's borders to other citizens of the European Union. Since then, French women have been able to cross the border daily in the morning to work in Switzerland, and in the evening to return to their home in France. Geneva prostitutes are divided into two categories. Pool de luxe is a high-class call girl and a street prostitute. The latter operates in an area located near the city's Cournavre railway station. This area is known as Le Paquis. Bern Street is full of sex shops, strip clubs, and massage parlors. This neighborhood never sleeps. There is a long queue of taxis waiting outside the station all night, waiting to take home sex workers. Their clients or revelers coming out of numerous Chinese, Filipino, Greek, or Turkish restaurants. A small police car discreetly patrols the area from sunset to heyday. A high-class call girl works in bars of luxury hotels. There are 15 5-star and 26 4-star hotels in Geneva. But was Edward Stern a client of such women? The police quickly established that he behaved modestly, not only in his professional, but also in his personal life. However, they also learned that in 1997 year, he was close to the former Miss Russia Yulia Legova, who lived in Paris at that time. In 1999, she gave birth to a son who was named Maximilian. The boy's birth certificate did not include the father's name, but few people in Edward's entourage doubted who his father was. The boy, who was only 5 months old and who was in the care of Edward, died in a Paris hospital in the 2000th year, apparently from a head injury caused by excessive shaking. The circumstances of this case are still unclear. Then Julia was warned not to even mention this topic. But the baby, who became the subject of a custody battle, was looked after by a nanny. She disappeared shortly after his death. Then Yulia said that the nanny was involved in the death, and a police investigation was launched, which it is not known how it ended. The nanny was an illegal immigrant from Romania, and it was assumed that she had fled back to her country. After this incident, Stern saw the former Miss Russia less and less, and soon they stopped communicating altogether. One day, Edward even invited his psychoanalyst to meet Julia for breakfast to determine whether she would become a suitable wife. The psychiatrist concluded that Julia would be a bad spouse for him. As a rule, the sexual life of every person is always shrouded in mystery and is not flaunted. It is even more difficult to find out about a person's sexual preferences when that person is rich and can pay for secrecy. And if this person lives in Switzerland, the world's capital of secrecy, you begin to feel the thick clouds of secrets enveloping the personal life of Edward Stern. He was an enthusiastic nature. Even before his death, colleagues openly discussed his sexual orientation. There were constant rumors that he was gay. After his death, details of Stern's sexual life became the main topic of dinner parties in Paris and New York. One international businesswoman claimed that Stern had a mistress in Paris. "I heard her say that she was a pervert and adored Edward because he had the most beautiful penis in the world. And she also had a huge black dildo that she used on her lovers." Like any typical Frenchman, Stern had his own circle of mistresses, with whom he was extremely generous. When this generosity crossed all imaginable boundaries, Kristen Van Riel, Edward's personal lawyer, intervened. In the early 90s, Stern told Van Riel that he was going to buy one of his mistresses an apartment in Manhattan for $1.5 million. After a skeptical Van Riel suggested that he tell his beloved that he was ready to buy an apartment and rent it to this girl, the mistress instantly left Edward, as promised in Henriel. Stern's vaunted analytical abilities were turned off in the case of communication with the fairer sex. "Every damn man in the world, from Edward to my father, when a woman tells him that he is the most beautiful and the most intelligent, he believes it," says the Stern family advisor with a sigh. One of the old friends of Beatrice, Edward's ex-wife, said that people around her were repeatedly surprised by her refusal to recognize Stern's sexual adventures during their marriage. After the divorce, Edward and Beatrice remained close friends, sometimes calling several times a day. Beatrice was even aware of some of Edward's new friends. According to the family counselor, there were at least 3 of them a few weeks before his death. They lived in Geneva and Paris. Stern rarely mentioned their names in conversation, but he made it a rule to give them a nickname. He called one of his mistresses Latex. No matter how strange this case looked, it immediately became clear that it would not be so difficult for the police to solve it. The only way into Stern's apartment was through a garage and a lobby equipped with surveillance cameras. Whoever killed Edward will definitely be captured on video recordings. Therefore, it soon became clear that only one person had entered Stern's apartment that night, and it was his mistress named Cecile. Her name was Cecile Brassard. At that time she was 36 years old, and she was a sculptor. However, in addition to the sculptures that she created in her spare time, her main job, apparently, was a very expensive escort. In addition, she specialized in sadomasochistic sex. Brassard's story is not unique in any way. The troubled daughter of a French advertising manager, she has changed a number of low-paid positions. She was a waitress in the Paris suburb of Roissy, a salesman in a leather goods store, worked as a model in several modeling agencies, according to an interview her father gave to the Geneva press. In the mid-90s, she decided to throw herself into an escort. Since then, father and daughter have hardly communicated. Like most call girls, Cecile Brassard preferred older men, the richer, the better, because her demands were very high. Chanel Hermes Grey Mercedes. In 1993, she spent her savings on buying a small house in the village of Nantel-Audouin, near Paris. She used it as a refuge, and there she kept strange erotically nude figures, which she hoped to exhibit one day in her own studio. In 1996, 26-year-old Cecile married a 56-year-old phytotherapist named Xavier Jelly, who ran a clinic located an hour's drive from Geneva. According to the Geneva newspaper, the couple is up to their ears in debt. Throughout her marriage, Brassard worked in an escort service, often slipping into Geneva hotel rooms as Alice in the image of a mistress. According to some reports, this is how she met Stern. Their relationship, which her lawyer dates back to 2000, the first year, seems to have started on a purely professional basis. According to some sources, Brassard was for some time connected with the infamous Margaret Network by a trans-European escort service, which was led by a British woman named Margaret MacDonald, and which was liquidated by the French police in 2002. What started out as banal sex for money soon turned into something more complicated. Brassard wanted to pursue a career in sculpture and interior design. And Stern wanted the same thing. He hired her to create a design project for his apartment. At least twice, Edward took her with him on business trips. According to colleagues, their destinations were Russia and India. Stern hid his personal life so carefully that his partner Sandy Koifman and his other colleagues found out about the separation of Edward and Beatrice only 6 years after their divorce. And they found out about the divorce in general after Stern's death. Stern's relationship with Bros was not going well. At each meeting, Stern begged her to leave her husband and marry him. But each time she objected, saying that she was afraid of a scenario in which she would throw everything she had, only for Stern to lose interest in her and leave her in a broken trough. However, Edward still found a way to disperse the melancholy. On February 12, 2005, 2 weeks before the murder, he opened a bank account in the name of Silbersar and deposited $1 million into it. A few weeks after his death, several suggestions were made as to why he did it. As Broussard herself would later tell the police, Edward transferred this money to her so that she would part with her husband and gain financial independence. But this plan didn't work. On the 24th of February, Stern called Kristen and Henriel and said that he had a problem. Stern informed his lawyer Obraztsar about $1 million and that she had disappeared somewhere. Henriel rolled his eyes, then, taking the numbers, Cecile called her apartment, a country house, and a mobile phone. No one answered him. With Stern's approval, Andriel ordered her bank account frozen. Stern was sullen. He believed that he had lost his beloved forever. In André, or he didn't think so. Now that Cecile's account was frozen, he predicted that she would call the very next day. And so it turned out. Broussard wasn't happy about the account freeze. By Friday, Andriel had returned to his country house in France. It was only after Stern's death that he learned that Edward had arranged for a flight from Paris to Geneva on the same day. February 25th. Stern met with her at least twice this weekend, presumably to discuss a frozen bank account. Their last meeting took place when Broussard came to Stern's apartment on the evening of Monday, February 28th. Everything that is known about that night is obtained from old and third-hand sources. From lawyers and local reporters who discovered a couple of leaks from the police. According to Cecile, she and Stern first talked in the kitchen. Then, he wanted to have sex. He put on latex bodysuits, and she put on her sadomasochistic outfit. Black tights, a black leather mini skirt with suspenders and a leather top. She had a whip and some white rope. She tied up Edward. There were 4 holes in his latex bodice. 2 for the eyes, 1 for the mouth, and 1 in the crotch area. Her tights also had a hole in the crotch area. He pressed a button hidden in the living room furniture, and 2 secret drawers opened. In one lay sex toys for making love, in the other 3 loaded pistols. Cecile Broussard continued to ask questions about money. But Edward refused to talk about this topic. His hands were tied, and he was sitting astride one of the toys from the first box. When Cecile started talking about money again, Edward blurted out, $1 million is too much for a whore. Then Cecile, in a rage, grabbed one of the Smith & Wesson model pistols and shot the man at point-blank range. When the first bullet hit him, Edward, who was in excellent physical shape at the age of 50, got up, but collapsed to the floor. After Cecile fired 2 more shots into his body. Then she fired one last shot, at his right temple. Edward Stern was lying dead on the floor of his bedroom. 1 bullet hit him in the chest, 1 in the stomach, and 2 more in the brain. Cecile's actions immediately after she fired 4 bullets at her lover at point-blank range were the main subject of disputes between prosecutors and Cecile's lawyer. The defense argued that after the crime, Cecile acted insanely and irrationally, while the prosecution argued that she had rational motives for everything she did after Edward's murder, and she was completely in control of her actions. After killing Edward, Cecile tried to cover her tracks. She packed up her fetish gear. Tights, dog collar, latex suit and other accessories. And also a few cans of Diet Coke, which they drank with Edward. And put it all in a black leather bag. And the murder weapon, 2 other large-caliber pistols that Edward kept in a drawer, and 4 spent cartridges. were put in a white cloth bag. She left the apartment, locking the door behind her. The road from Geneva to Montreux runs through one of the most beautiful places in the world. First, you drive along the lake with a water cannon with a jet height of 152 meters, which is the highest figure in Europe. On a clear day, Mont Blanc, 4,810 meters high, stretches on the horizon beyond the lake. Then you turn onto the highway, which passes through the hills and terraced vineyards of Lavaux, included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. However, that night Cécile Brissard did not pay attention to the beautiful landscape. She had only one thought: to return to the mantra as quickly as possible, but to do it so that the speed monitoring radar on the highway did not record her speed above the permitted 120 kilometers per hour. However, she violated another Swiss traffic law. She made 2 calls on her mobile phone. One call was made to the lawyer, the other to the husband. She left a message on the lawyer's phone saying that she had done something stupid, but did not go into details. She told her husband that she had another quarrel with Stern and she had had enough, so she had to fly to the other side of the world. When she reached Montreux, she stopped at the pier where river boats picked up passengers for cruises on the lake. I reached the end of it and threw a white cloth bag into the water. She stopped again, wanting to get rid of the whip. City construction inspectors have already put out garbage cans in the morning, into one of which the woman threw the whip. There are several versions according to which Xavier Jelly knew about what happened in Stern's penthouse. But, as the police found out, after listening to the recordings of the couple's mobile phone conversations, a few minutes after Brassard ended the conversation with her husband, his mobile phone recorded a call, in which he reserved a train ticket for her to Rome. That evening, she was to take the Mantra-Rome train, leaving at 23:40. The next call was with a request to book a ticket for his wife to Sydney, Australia. She was scheduled to leave Rome on an Australian Airlines flight the next morning at 7:40. Returning home, Brossa threw her clothes into a suitcase on wheels and then made another phone call. She called her aunt and uncle in France, her closest relatives. They knew that their niece was Stern's mistress, and they knew that their relationship had been tense lately. That evening, she left them a message saying that she had quarreled with Edward again and was going to leave for a while. Cécile boarded a train going to Rome, but realized that by mistake, when the train had already left the station. She boarded a local commuter train. She got off the train in the nearby town of Villeneuve and took a taxi to get to the next station before the train, and there already get on the right train. However, she was too late to get there. As a result, Cécile took a taxi for €800 to Milan airport. Her journey was more than 700 kilometers. On the way, Cécile threw the spent casings from the murder weapon and the keys to Edward's apartment out of the window. This detail will not escape the attention of a visionary taxi driver. The airport was closed when they arrived around 4:30 in the morning. Cécile offered to pay more to the taxi driver to take her to Rome, but he refused. Then Cécile started banging her fists on the taxi window, screaming hysterically. As a result, she had to wait in the cold at the main entrance until the airport opened in a couple of hours, after which she bought a booked one-way ticket to Sydney. It is reported that Cécile chose Australia as her destination, because for her it was the farthest place from Geneva. In addition, they once went there with Edward. Before boarding a connecting flight in Vienna, Cécile called her lawyer and asked him to do everything possible to cancel the blocking of her account for $1 million. Cécile then took a large dose of sedatives and slept through most of the 24-hour flight to Sydney. Once there, she stayed at a hotel at the airport. When Brissard got to Sydney, she made 3 phone calls. 5 minutes after landing, she called a banker in Montreux to see if the account had been unfrozen, and one to a lawyer with a request to speed up the defrosting. On the same day, Brissard called Stubble's half-sister Fabine in Paris and asked if the rumors that something had happened to Edward were true. However, I got to my stepsister a little earlier in Henriel. He asked Fabine to turn on the speakerphone. The sister informed Cécile that the police had found Edward's body. Then Brossa started crying. They listened as Broser, who at that time was not yet suspected of involvement in the crime, said that she had visited Stern on the night of his death and broke up with him. "Tell her she has to come back to give evidence," whispered V. Henriel. Playing the role of a grieving friend, Broser had to fly back to Geneva. Jelly had booked a plane ticket for her again. While in Sydney, Cecile also sent a parcel of clothes to her uncle and aunt in France. According to some reports, Cecile sent ordinary clothes. But really, the package contained the fetish costume she was wearing when she shot Edward. It is now believed that Cecile's trip to Australia was part of a cold-blooded and calculated plan, and not a disorderly mad escape. So, while in Sydney, Cecile instructed her husband on the phone, for example, to wash the Mini in which she drove to Stern's apartment and back on the day of the murder. When Cecile left Edward to die after she shot him, she didn't know for sure if he was alive or dead. Also, Cecile, during a telephone conversation with her sister, learned about rumors that said that Edward died after she left the country, and on the phone repeated several times, as if by chance, that she could not have killed him because she had an alibi. Then she decided to return to Switzerland, shrewdly, irrationally deciding that her return would clear her of any suspicion. So Broussard stayed in Sydney for only 24 hours, and then flew back to Switzerland. When the plane landed in Singapore for a stopover, Cecile had a panic attack, and she began to scream hysterically. When she read about the murder of Edward on the front page of the French newspaper Le Figaro, a doctor was called to her, who reluctantly agreed to let her continue the flight, and he wrote out a prescription for additional sedatives. Although Cecile was really in a hysterical state, she managed to call her lawyer and the bank. She also contacted her aunt, who agreed to meet her at the airport and take her home. By this time, the Geneva police had already viewed the surveillance footage in the basement and also heard from the concierge and his wife, as well as from associates, friends and relatives of Stern, that he had an affair with a French woman named Cecile Broussard. They notified their French colleagues, and they also began searching for Broussard. Cecile's uncle and aunt came from France and were waiting at Zurich airport to take her niece home. They wanted to hear from Broussard about Stern's murder. The woman did not deny that she had seen him on the night of the murder, but was adamant that he was healthy and alive when she left. When the uncle and aunt dropped off their niece and went to their house, they did not notice that there was a small object lying in the back seat of their car, a gold Swiss watch that belonged to Edward Stern. Brosa left them there without telling her relatives about it. The next day, Saturday, the 5th of March, in the afternoon, Broussard, accompanied by her husband, entered the main building of the Geneva Judicial Police. Earlier, talking to her on the phone, her aunt and uncle convinced her that despite her innocence of the banker's death, she should go to the police and not let the police come to her house. For the next 10 hours, the police questioned Broussard and Jelly, but they were questioned as witnesses, not as suspects. Broussard called Jelly her companion, and Stern the man of her life. She expressed surprise when asked if she had shot him. At 8 o'clock in the evening, they were told that they were free. Investigator Graeber decided that he still did not have enough evidence to charge Roser with murder, but lived in complicity. But what Broussard and Jelly didn't know was that while they were in police custody, a listening device was installed in their home phones and cars. Their cell phones were also confiscated. Returning to the apartment, Broser began to put things in order in her affairs. She called her lawyers in Switzerland and in France, her friends, as well as Stern's friends. She wanted her French lawyer to sell Gilly and her house in France. Broussard also asked the lawyer to contact the lawyers of Edward's heirs. She wanted to negotiate with them about the division of $1 million. She wasn't going to just give up that money. On Thursday, the 10th of March, Stern was buried at the Jewish cemetery in Geneva. Broussard informed his associates that he was going to attend the funeral. She wondered if she should wear black clothes because a few days earlier, at a meeting with a lawyer, she was dressed all in pink. More than 60 people attended the funeral. Bross was not among them after all. The next day, Aunt and Uncle Cecilia Brossard received a package sent by her niece from Australia on the 3rd of March. They opened it and called their lawyer. There was also a letter among the things. Broser asked me to wash my clothes and keep them in a safe place. She apologized for inconveniencing them with her request. The couple handed the clothes and the letter to the lawyer, and Stern's gold watch. He, in turn, handed everything over to the police. Why Brossard kept the sadomasochistic outfit, and why she sent it to her uncle and aunt in France, as well as why she left Edward's watch in their car, she did not explain. Meanwhile, the examination found Cecilia Brossard's fingerprint on Edward's latex suit. This was more than enough to issue a warrant for her arrest. On the morning of Tuesday, March 15th, 5 days after Stern's funeral, the police came to Brossard's apartment and searched her, and then took the woman to the police station for questioning. By 23 o'clock, she couldn't stand it and confessed everything. After that, the detective took her to Lake Lyman, where she threw away the murder weapon. The diver found it along with 2 other pistols and the key to Edward's apartment. Jelly was also detained, but only for further questioning. He quickly broke down and informed the police that Broser had told him that she had found Stern dead. According to her, Stern was shot. This confession was a confirmation for the police that it was Broser who pulled the trigger. Lived, released from custody. He was not charged with complicity. Meanwhile, Van Riel and his colleagues had to deal with the disgusting consequences that Stern left behind. Denying speculation on everything from alleged homosexuality to his ties to the Russian mafia. For those who were close to Stern's family, the sadness over Edward's passing was compounded by the stain his death left on the family's legacy. The most terrible thing is that he will be remembered not for what kind of person he was, but for how he left this world. Cecile Brossard's cell, in which she was imprisoned to await trial, was on the 3rd floor of Champdalen Prison. Soon after her incarceration, she began to have long whispered conversations with Stern. One day, during one of these conversations, a warden came into her cell, and Cecile angrily ordered her to leave. "I'm talking to Edward, and I don't want to be disturbed," she shouted. Broser was holding a small teddy bear in her hands. The matron advised her not to be stupid. In response to this, the woman burst into tears. In the spring of 2000, psychiatrist Jack Gasser, after questioning and observing Cecile, stated that there was practically no evidence that Cecile had killed Edward in a state of passion. Gasser admitted that Cecile did have signs of borderline personality disorder, as well as narcissistic tendencies. However, the most important thing for the prosecution was that Cecile was not delirious, and her perception of reality did not change. When she killed Edward, Cecile attempted suicide shortly before the psychiatric report was published. She cut her wrist while being transported from Shembadalo prison to Bel Eid Hospital. However, her life was not in danger. She was heavily dependent on sedatives and constantly claimed to be in direct contact with Edward. Upon her return from the hospital, she was monitored as a potential suicide. However, this did not prevent her from trying to commit suicide several times again. She asked permission to take her 2 cats with her to the cell, which, of course, was refused. Many may think that this behavior of Cecile is a ploy designed to help convince the jury of her limited mental abilities at trial. However, even the Stern family's lawyer did not consider her behavior a ruse. He believed that this behavior could be due to the fact that she spent several years in solitary confinement. Like all prisoners who are allowed to wear their own clothes, she preferred to wear only white or pink things. She claimed that pink is Edward's favorite color, and white represents purity. Cecile's aunt and uncle visited her in prison. Her husband Xavier Jelly also visited her. The trial of Cecile Brossard was to take place in 2009 year. According to Swiss law, there are three categories of murderers. Assassinate means premeditated murder, for which the strictest sentence is provided. Murtra is an unintentional murder, for which a milder sentence is provided. But in order to get an even milder sentence, there is a category of mu passionnel murder on the basis of passion. In this case, the accused must convince the judge or jury that there were mitigating circumstances that led to the crime. The accused recognized muertra passional can receive from 1 to 10 years in prison, while mur receives sentences from 5 to 20 years. The assassin's sentence ranges from 10 years to life imprisonment. Criminals usually serve only 2/3 of their sentence. Therefore, if we take into account the term that Cecile has already served since 2005, she could theoretically be released in the courtroom. The trial of Cecile Brossard began in the Geneva Jury Court on Wednesday, June 10, 2009 year. Stern's ex-wife and their 2 children testified at the trial. Beatrice agreed to speak on the witness stand, but the 2 children were allowed to testify in private in the judge's office. In more than 4 years since the conclusion of the contract, the appearance of the Risette has changed a lot, and not for the better. She had become painfully thin, and her eyes, full of annoyance, looked out from her wrinkled face. 2 months earlier, on March 20th, she turned 40. On a good day, she can be lively, witty, pleasant. The next day, she may fall apart, the warden told about her a few days before the trial. On the first day of the trial, 30 journalists, who with great difficulty were granted accreditation to cover the trial, experienced great disappointment. The Stern family demanded that the trial be held behind closed doors to respect the suffering of the Stern children. And the presiding judge agreed, despite the fact that, according to him, he found this request surprising. Therefore, while the media representatives loitered outside, under a cloudy sky that threatened to burst into rain, Brassard's lawyer told prosecutors that his client shot her lover not in anger and in cold blood, but in a fit of passion. However, the defendant herself did not immediately begin to explain the essence of the case. Her first words were addressed to Stern's ex-wife and his children. "I would like to apologize, but it's impossible to apologize for something so disgusting." Then she also promised to tell the truth, saying, "The only thing I can do is try to explain how it was." She also asked Edward's ex-wife that if she died, would her death be a consolation for the family? To which Beatrice David while replied in the negative. The lawyer representing Edward's 3 children promised to prove to the court that it was Broser who tried to kill Edward Stern, and not the other way around. "I am here to make sure that the verdict will not be an insult to the victim's relatives," he said. On the second day of the trial, Xavier Jelly's husband Brossard testified. He said that he wanted to clarify the misunderstanding, despite the fact that, as reported, he did not object to his wife being the official mistress of another man. He replied that he did not know about this novel before Stern's death. He got the impression that his wife was a banker's secretary, albeit very sexy. Yes, he knew Edward and gave him a massage, but only because his back hurt. It was his wife who asked him to massage her boss. Stern once insulted him during a telephone conversation. The banker called him a cuckold. On the second day, another misunderstanding was corrected. The $1 million that Stern deposited into Roser's account was not returned to Edward's estate. The money was still in the Bank of Montreux. The credit firm Louise was still blocking the account, but the good news was that the money brought interest. Brassard also performed on this day. She talked about how passionately she loved Stern, but he called her a whore, and she snapped. She admitted that she shot him 4 times. According to her, he was sitting tied up in a chair when she shot him. "It wasn't a question of money. It was a matter of love," she said. "I pointed the gun at his face and fired the first shot. The gun must have been 6 inches from his face. I think I got him between the eyes. He got up, turned around and fell. I shot him in the head again. Witnesses called by the defense described Broser as a gentle, energetic, artistic young woman with simple tastes. That is, the most ordinary young woman. Stern's lawyer said that Broser repeatedly called her lawyer to prevent the freezing of the account with $1 million. He noted that Stern was tied up at the time of death. Who left him in this position? He asked and added. She awakened the fantasies of a 50-year-old man who became dependent on a sexy little blonde from the suburbs. The jury was asked to decide whether the murder of the French banker was an act of passion or cold-blooded murder. The jury chose cold-blooded murder, committed, however, by reason of insanity. Cécile Brassard was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. Since by that time she had already served half of her sentence, then in a year or two, she could have been released either for health reasons or for good behavior. $1 million, according to the court's decision, was transferred to the Stern account. In addition, she was ordered to pay Stern's children 1 Swiss franc, a little more than 100 rubles for moral damage. Cécile Brassard came out on Wednesday, the 10th of November, of the murdered banker, took this news with fury. Sentenced to 8 years in prison in June of the 29th year, after she had been in custody since March of the 25th year. She was eligible for release on the 6th of October, 2010 year, because she served a quarter of her sentence. She was serving time in the Ariane Park Women's Prison in Geneva. This prison cannot be called ordinary. A large 19th-century villa with no visible signs of a prison is often mistaken for the home of a bourgeois family. It has only 16 beds and never contains more than half a dozen people. According to the Swiss judicial system, Swiss women are generally law-abiding. So only 5.5% of prisoners in Switzerland. Women. On her way out of prison, Cécile was met by her sister. She took her to France. And this border at that time a 41-year-old woman should not cross for 10 years. It was for this period that the court expelled her from Switzerland. In the 2013 year, for the first time after the trial, she told about the murder, confessing that she always regretted her actions and missed her lover, who was a beautiful and bright person.